Whiteness is pure fantasy.
Which also then leads to a possible argument, which is to say that racism is a kind of failed attempt at sublimating bodiliness. But just also to add to that, why I think those arguments are useful is that, you know, historically we often refer back to a Freudian trajectory within Fanon's thought, which is legitimate, which is potent, which is really important, but that it's often a kind of projection of id, of sexuality onto the racial other. Now, that's true, but I think what happens with this layering of different theories, with what Kalpana's arguing, what Michelle Stevens is, it's also the what I call a delegation of an abject status or pure bodiliness or animality to the other. So rather than just thinking, and I mean, the sexual dimension is crucial, but it's not always, I mean, another shorthand way of saying that is that if one is involved, if racism constantly involves that, dare I say, projection, delegation of id to the other, that's not just sexuality. Sexuality may be one of the most potent forms of a kind of livid jouissance, but it's not the only one. And I mean, just to take that one step further, one of the things that amazes me in some of these theories is that it's not just jouissance, but there's also some kind of superego terror which comes with that. And I mean, back to George Floyd, one of the things that I think is so disturbing about those kinds of murders and that form of violence, which many theorists and critics have linked to as a kind of contemporary form of lynching, is that it's almost as if that there's a superego enjoyment, as if that there's some kind of perverse lawfulness in the perpetuation of that type of violence. And that's a profoundly disturbing argument, but also an important one to make. And I think if we always think of racism as somehow a renegade, we kind of miss the point, because sometimes racism itself recycles super egoic values, which I think is crucial.
Yes, there's a question that's come up sort of almost completely on that subject. So, you know, Seth says, can you say a little bit more about George Floyd and the big other, and perhaps the jouissance of the other? And what is the articulation between lack and enjoyment there? If Floyd's murder wasn't just a failure of the law, what was it then that the big other could no longer deny? How is the psychoanalytic approach different in this topic, perhaps, say, than Foucauldian or biopolitical approaches?
Yeah, that's tough. I mean, you know, I don't think that we need to see them as necessarily antagonistic. You know, sometimes people want to say, well, leave the Foucault, Lacanian, whatever. But maybe just to try and build upon the same point. I mean, you know, I offered this thought about how it instantiates a kind of witnessing and a non-deniability. So there's that. But I think, you know, without wanting to return us to that footage, you know, what was kind of, I suppose, of course, that's exactly what I am doing. But one of the things that was most disturbing was how calm and focused on the task at hand Derek Chauvin was. You know, he was going ahead and doing that, and it felt like he was doing something where he had the full assurance that he was a representative of law, and that he was doing something that was right. That racism involves, as I've kind of just said, the resources of lawfulness. There's somehow, I mean, other moments, okay, so Adorno, I think it's repressive desublimation, this notion that there's moments when you have id and superego which come together in this kind of unholy alliance, in a conjunction whereby rape is also a weapon of war, whereby I can be a patriotic soldier and still explore a whole series of id impulses. And the Lacanian version of that is to say that when you see jouissance, bear in mind that it's not just this inflammation, this libidinal intensity that's there for my, you know, getting off. It also often brings with it the function of the superego. And so thereby, I get gratification about an excessive implementation of a superegoic command. And let me stop there, but it's just, I don't think maybe Foucauldian theorization gets us to a similar point. But that unholy conjunction of superego and jouissance, I think that gives something slightly distinctive to the theorization. Sheldon, I don't know. Do you have further thoughts on that?
I would just say that there's a, there's a historical legacy of the law, specifically in the American context, being rooted in transgression. The law encourages you to transgress, right? The slave code encourages violence against the slave. So what you have is the legalistic code at odds with any sort of moral code. And this is something that E. Tribrolu argues in his piece on white nationalist killers. He talks about the ways that historically the function of the individual who stands up for the law, the vigilante, is someone who has to step in when the law fails. So the sense is that the vigilante is even more moral than the law. The vigilante steps in to reassert the law in a way that the law cannot do for itself. And so these killers, these white nationalist killers, shooting up churches, and they think that there is a greater law, a law connected to whiteness, connected to the purity of whiteness, or to the purity of the white woman who is supposedly raped by the savage Black man, right? So there's a sort of deeper moral law that they are bound to that allows for transgression of the written legalistic law.
Yeah, that's great, Sheldon. Actually, it's a terrific link that you put in place. It reminds me also, actually, Sheila Kavanagh has got a wonderful chapter in the book, which is entitled Race, Perversion, and the Portrait of Jason, which is a discussion of the film. But the reason I mention it is, and I think when Sheldon and I have been thinking about further levels of theorization, where to go next, one of the topics that keeps on coming up when we think about these issues is perversion. But not simply perversion, well, that as well, at the level of clinical everyday features, but the idea that, almost precisely as Sheldon was saying it, that with these figures, the vigilante hero who needs to somehow take the law into their own hands, the law is not adequate, so one needs to instantiate law. And in thereby doing this, one somehow becomes the instrument of the other's jouissance. So I suppose what I'm building to is that Lacanian theorizations of perversion often have a really useful perspective on certain facets of racism, particularly in as much as there's a relationship between the law and racism, or the instantiation of law in racism. So I didn't flesh that out particularly well, but this moment where the lone vigilante hero takes law into their own hands and does it gratuitously and violently so, I think is an emblem, is a paradigmatic example of what we could call perversion in a Lacanian framework.
Yes, and Daniel has written in the Q&A, sort of comparing it to the January 6th attack on the Capitol as well. I think we have reached our time slot. Thank you so much to both of you. Honestly, that was a really wonderful discussion, and we've had many messages of thanks in the Q&A as well. I'm sorry that's all we have time for today, or that's all the time we've set aside for today, but maybe we can continue another time.